The only reason I still own my 4 rental properties today, the only reason I'm not sitting in some apartment wondering where everything went, is because when I fell in love with a man named Robert Harlow at 63 years old, I kept my mouth shut about what I actually owned. It was the smartest thing I have ever done in my life, and I almost didn't do it. My name is Carol. I'm 66 now, and I've been managing residential rental properties in the Austin, Texas area for almost 20 years. Not a massive operation, nothing you'd read about in a business magazine. Just 4 single-family homes in solid neighborhoods, Cedar Park, Round Rock, Pflugerville, and one in a quiet part of North Austin that I've bought, maintained, and rented out one careful decision at a time. Every mortgage paid off. Every property in my name alone. Combined, they're worth just under $2 million and bring in about $11,000 a month in rental income after expenses. I also run a small property management side business, which handles 4 other properties for out-of-state owners who pay me a flat monthly fee to deal with everything from leaky faucets to lease renewals. None of that happened because I was lucky. It happened because my husband Frank worked himself half to death as a general contractor for 32 years, and when a heart attack took him at 58, he left me with 2 paid-off houses and the stubborn belief that I could figure the rest out myself. I was 44 years old with 2 adult kids, an associate's degree in business administration, and a very steep learning curve. I took the insurance money. I took the equity in our house in Leander. I sold that house, moved into the smaller of Frank's 2 rentals, and I got to work. I earned my real estate license at 46. I bought my 3rd property at 50, my 4th at 55. I made mistakes. I had a tenant trash a kitchen in Pflugerville and disappear owing 3 months of back rent. I had a water heater flood the Round Rock property and learned more about subrogation claims than I ever wanted to know. I had a property management client fire me after 2 years, which stung, but I found 2 better ones the following month. By the time I turned 60, I had something I hadn't expected to build, a real business, a real income, and a real sense of who I was without Frank standing next to me. My daughter Rebecca is in Nashville. My son Daniel is up in Denver. They have kids, careers, lives that don't leave much room for their mother except on holidays and birthdays, which I understood even if it made the house quiet in a way that took some getting used to. I had my hiking group, my book club, a good neighbor named Patsy who kept me honest, and a terrier named Biscuit who had strong opinions about everything. That was enough. I told myself that was enough. Then I met Robert at a Trail Conservancy volunteer cleanup day in the spring of 2 years ago. He was trimming invasive cedar alongside the Barton Creek Greenbelt when I arrived with my group, and he handed me a pair of work gloves without being asked, which I thought was either considerate or presumptuous. He said his name was Robert, that he was 61 and newly settled in Austin after years in Charlotte, North Carolina. He had the kind of face that gets more distinguished with age rather than less salt and pepper hair worn short, good posture, the weathered hands of someone who'd actually used them. He said he was a semi-retired architect who'd wound down his practice a few years back and was taking on select consulting work while he figured out what the second half of his life looked like. We talked for 4 hours while we cleared brush. He was funny and curious and listened in a way that felt like a lost art. When the group packed up, he asked if I'd want to grab coffee sometime. I told him I'd think about it and gave him my number. I drove home and told Biscuit about it, which is how I knew I was already in trouble. We got coffee, then dinner, then a hike through Pedernales Falls State Park on a Saturday morning where we talked about our late spouses and our grown children and the particular loneliness of building a life for 2 and then suddenly having to figure out how to live. For one. His wife Patricia had died 3 years earlier from a stroke. He said he'd spent the first 2 years afterward just trying to remember who he was outside of their marriage. I understood that more than I could say. He was careful and attentive. He opened doors not in a performative way but in the quiet habit of someone raised to do it. He remembered I'd mentioned a problem tenant and asked about it 3 weeks later. He brought Biscuit a chew toy on our 4th date without making a big production of it, which somehow got to me more than flowers ever could. By the summer, I was falling for him in the way you fall, when you're old enough to know you're doing it not in a rush, not blind, but deliberately and with your whole chest. I told him I owned rental properties. I mentioned it early, actually, because I'm not someone who hides what I do. I told him I had a few houses I rented out and did some property management on the side. He nodded and said that sounded like a smart, stable business. He didn't ask for specifics and I didn't volunteer them. How many properties? I was vague. Maybe 2 or 3, I said once. He didn't push. I wasn't sure why I kept it vague, honestly. Frank always said I had good instincts even when I couldn't explain them. I was listening to something I couldn't name yet. He proposed in October. We were sitting on the dock at Lake Travis after a sunset boat tour with a group of friends, and he pulled out a ring I later found out he'd had designed by a jeweler on South Congress. Simple, elegant, exactly my taste. I said yes before he finished the sentence. Rebecca flew in from Nashville the following weekend. She liked him. She said he seemed grounded, that she hadn't seen me look like myself in years. Daniel called from Denver and said he trusted my judgment, that he just wanted me to be happy. Their support made the whole thing feel even more real. The first thing that didn't sit right happened about 3 weeks after the engagement. Robert and I were having dinner at home. I'd made chicken piccata, his request, and he brought up finances in a way that felt slightly rehearsed. Just in general terms, he said, he thought it was a good idea for couples remarrying later in life to get a full picture of each other's financial situation before the wedding. He offered to share everything he had. His investment accounts, his consulting income, whatever I wanted to see. He pushed a folder across the table like he'd been holding it in his lap. I thanked him. I said I appreciated the transparency and I'd share what felt relevant when I was ready. He smiled and said, of course, but the folder stayed on the table for a moment longer than it needed to. 2 weeks later, he mentioned he knew a financial planner who specialized in combined asset planning for blended families. Very discreet, he said. Very experienced with people who come into a marriage with complicated property situations. He could set up a meeting if I wanted. I said I had my own people, thanks. He didn't argue. The real thing happened 6 weeks before the wedding. His son flew in from Charlotte. His name was Marcus, 29 years old, worked in commercial real estate lending, polite in the way that people are when they're watching you rather than talking to you. Robert was clearly proud of him. We had dinner at Uchi on a Friday, which I'd suggested because I wanted neutral ground and good food, and for the first hour it was fine. Marcus asked about Austin, about my hiking group, about how Rebecca and Daniel had taken the news of the engagement. Then, right around the time the dessert menu arrived, he tilted his head and said, "So I hear you're in the rental property game." He said it the way people do when they're setting something up. I said yes, I managed a few properties. He nodded in the way people do when they don't believe you. You know, he said, rental income can be structured really efficiently if you have the right entity set up. Are you operating under an LLC or just personally? Personally, I said. He made a small sound that was not quite a wince. That's a real liability exposure issue. You're leaving yourself open on all 4 sides. Has anyone walked you through the advantages of a family trust structure? I felt my back straighten. Robert said, Marcus, we're having dinner. But Marcus kept going. He said he'd worked with a lot of investors who were in similar situations and that it made real sense, especially in a marriage situation, to think about consolidating management under a shared entity. Tax advantages, he said. Estate planning simplicity. Protection. I folded my napkin and set it on the table. I appreciate that, I said. But I have an attorney and a CPA who've managed my structure for years, and I'm comfortable with it. His smile tightened. Of course, he said. In the car on the way home, Robert apologized. He's passionate about real estate, he said. He gets carried away. I said it was fine, and looked out the window and filed it away somewhere cold and quiet. The next morning, I called my attorney. Her name is Janet Pryor. She's been handling my real estate contracts and business matters for 11 years. She's the kind of person who speaks in complete sentences, charges reasonable fees, and never once in 11 years has been wrong about something that mattered. I told her what had happened at dinner. I told her about the folder, the financial planner, Marcus's questions. There was a pause. She said, I want to run a background check on Robert Harlow. Do I have your permission? I said yes. She called me back in 4 days and asked me to come to her office. She said it the way doctors say it when they want to tell you something in person. I sat across from her desk on a Tuesday afternoon, and she slid a manila folder toward me. I opened it. Robert Harlow had filed for personal bankruptcy in 2017. Before that, he'd operated a small architecture firm in Charlotte that dissolved in 2014 with significant unpaid contractor debts. He had not, as far as anyone could determine, operated as a licensed architect since 2016. His consulting work was one small contract with a regional developer, generating less than $18,000 in the previous year. None of that was what made my hands go cold. What made my hands go cold were the three names on the next page. The first was a woman named Sylvia Marsh in Raleigh, North Carolina. Sylvia owned a small catering business she'd built over 18 years. She'd met Robert through a civic organization in 2018, gotten engaged within 8 months, and married him in the spring of 2019. 14 months after the wedding, she discovered that Robert had been slowly liquidating her business's equipment, kitchen appliances, transport vehicles, refrigeration units through a resale operation Marcus ran on the side. By the time she realized what was happening, over $60,000 in business assets had been converted to cash she never saw. She filed a lawsuit. Robert filed for bankruptcy shortly after. She recovered almost nothing. The second was a woman named Gloria Fontaine in Greenville, South Carolina. Gloria owned 2 small storage unit facilities she'd inherited from her father and expanded over 15 years. She met Robert at a wine tasting event in 2020, engaged within 6 months. After the wedding, Robert introduced her to a property restructuring consultant who convinced her to consolidate both facilities under a new holding company. The consultant, it turned out, was Marcus operating under a different name. The restructuring transferred operational control to an LLC Marcus had established. The facilities never returned to Gloria's direct ownership. She spent 2 years in litigation and lost one of the properties completely in the process. The third was a woman named Renee Caldwell in Asheville. Renee owned 3 furnished short-term rental cabins in the mountains outside the city. She was smarter or luckier, or both. When Robert started pushing her to hire a financial restructuring advisor before the wedding, she got suspicious and hired a private investigator. The PI traced the advisor back to Marcus. She broke off the engagement. She also filed a complaint with the North Carolina Real Estate Commission and a report with the Asheville Police Department. The police report was what Janet had used to find the other 2 women. Janet said, "They all owned property, all between 58 and 66, all widows. All met him through social organizations. And Marcus is not just his son, he's his business partner in every meaningful sense." I thought about the folder Robert had slid across the dinner table. The financial planner who specialized in blended family asset situations, Marcus asking whether I was operating under an LLC. "How many properties do you have, exactly?" I asked Janet what to do. She said, "First, you do not change anything. You go home. You act normal. You do not let him know that you know anything. Second, I'm contacting the FBI field office in Austin. What they've done crosses state lines repeatedly and involves wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. Third, I'm also calling the attorney who represented Renee Caldwell. She's been waiting for something like this." She looked at me steadily. "You're in a position the other 3 women weren't in," she said. "Why?" I asked. "Because he doesn't know what he's actually dealing with. He thinks you have 2 or 3 properties, loosely managed, no legal structure. He has no idea what your actual assets are, your actual income, or that you have an attorney who's known you for 11 years and doesn't take 30 seconds to pick up the phone." She paused. "And you have a prenup?" "Right. The prenup. We'd signed one in November, something Robert had agreed to easily, which had actually made me feel better at the time and now made me feel like a fool for ever relaxing. But Janet had drafted ours, not Robert's attorney, and she'd made it airtight in ways that even Robert's side had pushed back on. They'd wanted a clause that would have entitled Robert to a share of any property-based income generated during the marriage. Janet had shut it down in one sentence. "My client's assets and their income remain exclusively hers, full stop." Robert's attorney had grumbled and then dropped it. The next 8 weeks were the strangest of my life. I went home that Tuesday afternoon and made dinner. I asked Robert about his day. I laughed at something he said about a neighbor's dog. I lay next to him in the dark and stared at the ceiling and told myself that Janet knew what she was doing and that I just had to hold on a little longer. He kept pushing, but carefully, the way you push on something you're not sure will hold. He suggested we consolidate our finances to simplify things. I said I preferred to keep things separate for tax reasons. He mentioned Marcus was available to consult if I ever wanted a second opinion on my property structure. I said I was happy with my current team. Once, he came into the kitchen while I was on the phone with one of my tenants, a routine call about a broken gate latch in Cedar Park, and I watched his face arrange itself into something carefully neutral while he poured himself a glass of water. He was listening. I knew he was listening. I kept my voice completely boring for the rest of the call. Marcus came back to Austin once more, about 5 weeks in. He took us both to lunch and steered the conversation with impressive subtlety toward estate planning. He mentioned something about how a lot of people his parents' age didn't realize how exposed their assets were to probate complications. He mentioned a firm he knew that did excellent work. I thanked him and said I'd have my attorney reach out if I had questions. His eyes went flat for just a moment. I noticed it. I didn't show that I noticed it. 3 days after that lunch, Janet called. She said, Friday. She said the FBI, working with the North Carolina AG's office and a U.S. attorney in the Western District of North Carolina, had obtained arrest warrants for both Robert and Marcus Harlow. The warrants covered federal wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and identity theft charges related to Sylvia Marsh and Gloria Fontaine. Renee Caldwell's complaint had finally given investigators enough to build a prosecutable case. The evidence Janet and I had gathered documented conversations, records of Marcus's requests, the recorded phone call where Robert explicitly asked me to consult with a firm he refused to name the ownership of had been added to the federal file as evidence of ongoing attempted fraud. I asked if I needed to do anything. She said, "Go to work Friday morning. Come home at your usual time." That's all. I drove to my Pflugerville property that Friday to do a move-in walkthrough with a new tenant. I showed her where the circuit breaker was and explained the recycling schedule and gave her my contact card and drove home. I turned onto my street at 4:15, and there were 2 cars in the driveway I didn't recognize. Inside, there were 3 federal agents. Robert was sitting on the couch with his hands zip-tied in front of him, still in the shirt he'd been wearing when I left that morning. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him look. He looked like something that had been propped up and was no longer propped. One of the agents, a woman who introduced herself as Special Agent Vasquez, walked me through what was happening. She told me that Marcus had been arrested at his hotel on the east side of Austin within the same hour. She told me that Robert and Marcus's operation had been documented across 4 states over 6 years. She said the 3 previous victims had all been contacted and would be cooperating with the prosecution. Robert looked at me from the couch. He said, "Carol, please, just let me explain. You know me." I looked at him for a moment. He was right that I knew him, just not the way he meant. I said, "No, I don't think so." They took him out through my front door and put him in one of the cars, and I stood in my living room, and Biscuit sniffed the spot on the couch where Robert had been sitting and then looked up at me, the particular expression he reserves for things that don't smell right. The federal case moved slowly and then all at once. Both Robert and Marcus entered plea agreements 14 months later. The U.S. Attorney's Office had enough between the 2 victims in North Carolina and the documented attempt in Texas to make trial a losing proposition for both of them. Robert received 8 years in federal prison. Marcus received 5, with an additional 2-year supervised release period and a permanent ban from any involvement in real estate transactions or financial advisory services. As part of the plea, they agreed to financial restitution. It won't come close to covering what Sylvia and Gloria actually lost: the equipment, the business income, the years of litigation, the psychological damage of trusting someone completely and having that trust turned into a weapon. But it was something. And the conviction was something. And the fact that it's now on the public record is something for every woman who runs a search on either of their names going forward. I filed for divorce the Monday after the arrest. Janet had it finalized in under 3 months because the prenup made the financial untangling almost irrelevant. Robert's name had never been on any of my properties. Robert's name had never been on any of my accounts. Robert had lived in my house for 5 months and contributed nothing to it except some grocery runs and a very good pasta dish that I have absolutely no intention of ever making again. The divorce was the easiest part of all of it. I'm 66 now. I still own all 4 properties. my tenant in Round Rock just renewed her lease for a third year. The Cedar Park property needed a new roof last spring, which cost me more than I wanted to spend and less than I'd feared. My granddaughter in Nashville is 3 and already has opinions about things, which Rebecca says she got from me. Daniel came down to Austin in February with his family, and we hiked Enchanted Rock, and I did not fall behind once. I didn't go back to the Trail Conservancy volunteer events for a while after everything happened. I didn't feel afraid exactly, just tired in a particular way. But I went back in the fall, and I found that the work was still satisfying in the same way it had always been, and nobody asked me anything about my finances. And Biscuit seemed glad when I came home muddy and smelling like cedar. There is one thing I want to say clearly, because I've thought about it many times since all of this, and I think it matters. I did not save myself because I am exceptional. I am not. I'm a 66-year-old woman in Texas who learned property management from YouTube tutorials and 2 expensive mistakes, and who has had a good attorney for 11 years, largely because my neighbor Patsy recommended her at a dinner party. The difference between me and Sylvia and Gloria was not intelligence. It was not savvy. Sylvia built a catering business over 18 years. Gloria expanded 2 storage facilities she'd inherited. These are not foolish women. The difference was that I had never mentioned exactly what I owned, not because I suspected Robert specifically, because I had been doing this long enough to know that what you've built is yours to share on your own terms and no one else's timeline. Because Frank always said, trust your gut even when you can't explain it, and I couldn't explain it, but I listened anyway. Because Janet Pryor picks up the phone in 2 rings and does not hedge. If you're a woman who has built something, a business, a portfolio, a practice, anything, and someone you're dating starts steering conversations toward your financial structure before you've offered to have that conversation, that's information. If their family members are asking pointed questions about your asset exposure on a first meeting, that's information. If they offer solutions before you've described any problem, that's information. You don't have to act on it immediately. You don't have to be certain. But you are allowed to be slow. You are allowed to be vague. You are allowed to have a team that is yours, and to keep it that way. What I lost was 8 months. 1 ring I returned to the jeweler, and a pasta recipe I was probably overrating anyway. What I kept was everything else. And if that makes me the kind of woman who was careful with a man she loved, who kept part of herself back even in the middle of falling, who didn't share every corner of what she'd built just because someone asked nicely, then I will take that. I will take it without apology and without a second thought. Because the women who trusted completely lost things that can't be given back. I still have mine.